this statement has a deeper meaning. One of the most important meaning is that I constitute myself, and this is a process of self-constitution. The other meaning is that an amount of self-knowledge is involved in my knowledge about myself. So it's a kind of a self-reflecting, self-referencing kind of a self-knowledge. So reflection, reference, thinking backward and thinking forward are together in my knowledge about myself. And this is what decolonization precisely means. Now, how this decolonization is important for doing philosophy? It is important because it creates what we call as practical rationality. Practical rationality is different from, let's say, something that is impractical. And practical rationality also has this component of living with a certain kind of practice. Now, what kind of practice we live with or live in when we do philosophy? Professor Krishna, a noted Indian philosopher, used to call it philosophization. And what is philosophization? Philosophization for Professor Krishna, a very important Indian philosopher, is thinking creatively, is philosophization. And what is thinking? Thinking is a kind of art, he would say. So thinking is not necessarily connected to knowing, but thinking is connected to creatively affirming and creatively knowing oneself. How do creatively we know ourselves? We creatively know ourselves by using largely our faculty of imagination and not so much by using faculty of reason. So there is a dichotomy here between faculty of reason and faculty of imagination. And many Indian philosophers have emphasized on this dichotomy. One of them, of course, is Krishna, whom I am referred to. Faculty of reasoning is inferential, deductive, inductive, going up to a statistical form of reasoning. Now, any act of reasoning involves certain objects of thought. And these objects of thoughts must be referenced. They are not just referred as an object, but there must be a system of referencing around a domain of objects of thought, which are expressed through our sentences, through our verbalization, through our discourses. It's a discursive way of thinking that involves reasoning. Now, that is one way of thinking. Can we know ourselves discursively? Yes, we know ourselves discursively following Greek tradition of Plato and Aristotle, who are asking for a kind of critical self-examination. And critical self-examination for Plato involves pitting ourselves against an absolute. We pit ourselves against an absolute reality, whether we are able to know that absolute reality which is unchangeable and which we can merely imitate. That is Plato. As far as Aristotle is concerned, we pit ourselves against a world. So we have to know the world that surrounds us and within which we are located. So the way we know the world around, that defines us, and that's discursive mode of thinking. So self-knowledge for Plato and Aristotle is discursive thinking. But self-knowledge for Krishna, which depends on faculty of imagination, Krishna would say, this is the faculty of feeling. Now, Krishna is not saying this on his own. He's actually borrowing from Immanuel Kant. Why is he borrowing from Immanuel Kant? Immanuel Kant, in his third critique, which is called Critique of Judgment, actually delineates human faculties in a different manner then he delineates in Critique of Pure Reason. In Critique of Pure Reason, he delineates human faculty in terms of categorization. We categorize, we schematize, we provide a scheme of reasoning. Let's say we understand matter in terms of continuity, in terms of how much space they occupy, at what time they endure, So you have a certain scheme of reasoning. The concept of matter is covered by a scheme of reasoning, or the concept of matter is covered by a scheme or a category of reasoning, a category like possibility, a category like impossibility, a category like infinity. There are these categories in Kant in terms of which you understand. So schemes of reason and categories come together, but they do not come together without creating an antinomy, without creating an opposition between them. So therefore, the two critiques of Kant actually ends up creating an antinomy between scheme and category, to put it very, very simply, just to give you a refresher. But in Critique of Judgment, Kant wants to eliminate this antinomy by bringing in a sphere of feeling of pleasure or feeling of displeasure, is connected to reason. Reason is not connected to schematization and categorization. Reason is connected to feeling of pleasure and pain. And this is something very practical, because in economics we talk about utility. What is the utility of something? Let's say utility of Kant's Critique of Reason or Critique of Judgment. How does one determine utility? Is utility something that is subjectively determined? Can I subjectively measure the amount of pleasure or the amount of pain that is involved? Let's say I have taken COVID vaccine, the first dose of COVID vaccine. And many of you must have felt some pain after taking the vaccine. And some of you might not have felt the pain. Some of you who are well-bodied have felt that, no, I need not wait for this 60 days to take the second dose. I can do it in 21 days. Yeah. Now, how do we measure up to our own expectations, our own sense of pleasure and pain? Is it entirely subjective? Well, Amartya Sen would say that your subjective calculations of pleasure. Sometimes you feel that, okay, if I drink 1 cup of coffee, I'm very satisfied with this. Sometimes you feel that even after drinking 1 cup of coffee, you need some more energetic snacks so that you are properly fulfilled. So your level of satisfaction is put a little higher than it is usual for you. So your subjective calculation and the scale of subjective calculation, which has to be expressed in a certain choice. If you cannot express it in a certain choice, Professor Sen would say, then it is merely subjective. The moment you are able to express it in a certain choice, it becomes objective. But you move from subjective to the objective in calculating your pleasure or in calculating your pain. But then it is not just an individual. You look at the other person, whether the other person feels more satisfied with cappuccino or with Colombian coffee or with simple kind of coffee that is available in any Indian cafeteria. If you find that the other person goes for Colombian coffee and feels more satisfied, and then you are only given cappuccino and you are not able to decide between cappuccino and Colombian, then you look for some more person, how they decide. If you find that one more person decides for Colombian, because another person A has already decided about the Colombian coffee, then you say, okay, I will decide for the Colombian coffee. This is a kind of a loose version of what goes in the name of prisoner's dilemma. Now, pleasure and the pain, as Kant has rightly pointed out, actually determines practical rationality. And Dayakrishna says, rationality is all about feeling. Rationality is all about feeling pleasure or pain. But pleasure or pain are graded. For example, when you listen to a piece of music, that is one kind of pleasure. And when you drink a cup of coffee, is another kind of pleasure. And when you take an easel and you draw a painting, that's another kind of pleasure. But can we classify our states of pleasure? And he refers to Indian theory of Russia. There are 9 kinds of Russia. But 9 kinds of Russia are not good enough. States of pleasure, states of feeling ugliness, states of feeling ecstatic, states of feeling something humble and solemn. There are these 9 kinds of states in Indian theory of Russia. But this is not enough, Daya Krishna said. Additionally, you must have something called bhakti, which is simultaneously a sense of pleasure or pain and also a sense of devotion, a kind of spirituality. So spirituality and pleasure must come together in the form of a value. He calls it the 5th Purushartha. In Indian theory of Purushartha, you have Artha, Kama, Moksha, and the other one, 4th one. And the 5th one must be bhakti. Daya Krishna says. So Daya Krishna adds this notion of bhakti because bhakti is a stable sense of feeling, maybe feeling of pain, which you are able to endure, or feeling of pleasure, which you are able to bear with. If you have too much of a sense of pleasure, you may start dancing. That's a kind of an unbearable state of pleasure. If you have too much of pain, you are writhing in pain and you are crying and you are screaming. That also is not a stable state of pain. So you must reach at this stable state of pain and pleasure. And that is what is called Shanta in Indian tradition, when you are absolutely transfixed. You won't have to move a finger, but you are appropriating the entire pleasure and the pain. In fact, Immanuel Kant talks about that state of pleasure where you are absolutely transfixed as the final purpose in Critique of Judgment. And one has to reach to the stage of final purpose. Kant even calls it this final purpose is something that nature, the larger nature, produces for you. Nature creates a sense of final purpose. It's not just created in you, and it's not created through the other person. It's created by nature, which includes both humans and non-humans, which includes civilized and native people, who according to Kant are not so civilized, in Critique of Judgment. So, Critique of Judgment describes the fear of nature as something that is primordially available or primitively available. And that primitively available nature actually gives you the sense of purpose, the final purpose, in terms of which you stabilize your sense of pleasure or pain by overcoming all antinomies, all kinds of conflicts that you have between scheme and concepts, between your concept of pleasure and someone else's concept of pleasure. You stabilize everything by a final purpose given by a sense of nature. Now, Kant also alternatively calls this sense of nature, the sense of nature that you have, maybe internal nature and external nature. You can create a duality between your internal nature and external nature. Internal nature may be part of your self-knowledge, but external nature is part of your affirmation of the self, about which you know. So internal and external nature cannot be fully dissociated, as Descartes might have thought about, but Kant thinks that they cannot be fully dissociated. They have a connection. And my teacher, Professor Charles Taylor, actually wanted to explain this very difficult proposition, this difficult proposition of debate between Descartes and Kant, in Cogito ergo sum. It is the realm of the mental that determines the nature of the external world. You reach up to the state of the mental. It is mental that determines the external, extra-mental, in cogito ergo sum. But in Kant, The mental has to get its resources from the extramental, and they should be synthesized. Now that synthesis is imperfectly done, not perfectly done by our reason. In geometry, in mathematics, even in sciences, the combination between internal and the external is never perfect. It is incomplete, imperfect, only leaves you with partial knowledge. Therefore, with that kind of knowledge, you can never be satisfied. Now, the problem before us is how to combine the internal and the external. Professor Taylor looked at various facets of internal and the external, subjective, the notion of freedom, the kind of self-consciousness, the kind of awareness, all that we have. He looked at the nature of all that, and he found that the object of our inner nature, is a kind of a variety. It changes from time to time, from age to age. During pre-enlightenment era, yesterday Professor Sebastian was mentioning about epiphany. Epiphany is something like a revelation that comes to you, that comes to your consciousness. In the pre-enlightenment era, the nature of our inner self depended on epiphany. But in the Enlightenment, we removed all epiphany and we replaced epiphany by our current experience, the way we know the world, the way we experience the world. That may be a conceptual way, that may be an objectual way, and that may be also a combination between the conceptual and the objectual. You can bring both together, but you will know the world in a certain way, and that is the Enlightenment way of understanding and thinking. But that thinking is absolutely rudimentary. We have to think creatively. So how do you think creatively? That is the question posed by Professor Dayakrishna in The Art of the Conceptual. So Professor Dayakrishna, being an Indian philosopher, his quest was, how do I know myself? I know myself because I can think creatively. Now Charles Taylor, in his last book, which is about poetry, and the title of the book is very, very interesting. He calls it Cosmic Connections. Poetry in the age of disenchantment. This is the book that has come out 15 days back, Charles Taylor's book. It's available in India now. So Charles Taylor argues that we live through cosmic connections instead of natural connections. Kant talked about natural connections. Dayakrishna talked about thinking creatively. And Charles Taylor is talking about cosmic connections, widening the field, widening the horizon. That we live in different cosmos. All of us are connected to the cosmos, and our connections with the cosmos are not the same. We do not live by the same cosmic connections. And these cosmic connections are poetic. Many times it is reflective of our own past. Many times what we think creatively in our poetry, in our writing, in our expression. Those expressions actually create the connections. And these connections can dissolve the boundary between rationality and imagination. All the times we are trying to dissolve this boundary between rationality and imagination. Till the time we are able to dissolve the boundary, we are disenchanted. We are disenchanted by our own reasoning, but because our own reasoning cannot give us an absolute self-knowledge. It cannot stabilize our pleasure or pain. Therefore, we are disenchanted. And disenchantment produces a duality between what we are as our self and the other, the self and the non-self, the being and becoming, the being and non-being. So you have this infinite number of binaries that arise from our disenchantment with ourselves, with nature, until the point that we are able to understand the cosmic connections with which we live. Now, what is the cosmic connection? Because I teach these days philosophy of science, I can tell you our cosmic connections. Every morning when we see the sunshine, What is this sunshine except flow of photons, Photon particles are striking on our eyes. And if photon particles do not strike our eyes, we experience darkness. But because photon particles are striking our eyes, we are able to see the world, And that is a cosmic connection. Charles Taylor explains. Going beyond that, what is this photon all about? How is the photon created? Photon is created by a kind of a clash, a kind of a force that is transacted between one proton and another proton. Now, protons interact with each other. A large number of protons interact with each other, provided the surface is sufficiently heated up. The surface of the sun. In the surface of the sun, protons are interacting and generating these photon particles for us. Isn't this a cosmic connection? Why protons are generating photons? You can ask this question. A scientist, a quantum physicist will give you the answer. Because protons are not able to bind themselves together. To bind themselves together, they have to decay themselves. Protons have to decay themselves into lesser stable particles. Lesser stable particles like muons, like positrons, like gluons, like plasma gas. Protons have to degrade themselves to plasma gas. If proton can degrade themselves to plasma gas, from there we can get hydrogen. So that's a kind of a reverse process. Reverse process of a conflict or a fight between one proton and another proton. And how it is relevant for us, for a decolonized mind. I can give you an example of that. That's why I penned some books with. I hope I brought that book. Yes, I brought that book. This is a book by Professor Srinivasa Rao. Professor Rao was a professor of Bangalore University, a very solid professor of Indian philosophy. He died. And before his death, he published this book, Advaita, a Contemporary Critique. Now, what he says is very, very interesting here. Let me take you to his critique. He says, whenever there is this kind of a collision between one photon, one proton and another proton, there are two kinds of forces that emanate. One kind of force is a field that propagates forward, a field that goes forward. And another kind of propagation is the field that goes backward. So, what is reality then? Is reality a forward propagating field or a backward propagating field? Because forward propagating field gets decayed and backward propagating field stabilizes into something like muon, the most fundamental of all the particles that constitute our matter. So Advaita Vedanta would point out that, that we need to see in a manner that takes care of definite possibilities, he says. And these definite possibilities are different from everyday way of seeing, everyday way of knowing. So Advaita, according to Professor Srinivasa Rao, doesn't prescribe a particular way of seeing oneness, but it prescribes a certain way of seeing the world where you look at the possibilities. And he says, the search for unity or oneness is basically an aesthetic search. It's not an epistemological search, it's an aesthetic search. Thinking creatively, sensing Russia, in the movement of the particles, we have to sense Russia. We have to have that feeling of pleasure, of pain. That's connected to the final purpose of arriving at a certain stability. And therefore, what is reality? Professor Rao says, this is where I quote from this book. he says reality is ever new. Reality is ever new. It is not old or what you see just now, but it is ever new. So how do you see the ever new reality? He gives a fascinating statement here. I quote, if reality is ever new, how can one take a snapshot of it and use it? How at all can a snapshot of the ever new be very legitimately shot, offered, accepted, or significantly used if one can recognize, re-cognize an ever new reality by means of snapshots? How is it ever new? So that's a kind of a paradoxical situation. How is it ever new? What you call as ever new? And this paradox is further explained by Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna in Mulo Madhyamiko Karika. In a famous Karika, Nagarjuna, I put it in English, he says, if there is no essence, what could become other? If there is no essence, what could become other? If there is essence, what could become other? In both ways, there is a forward propagation and a backward propagation. But the question remains, what could become other if there is no essence? Can we answer this question? It's like a kind of craze, as Derrida would say. And in Mula Madhyamika Karika, Nagarjuna would say that it's a certain kind of emptiness, a kind of aporia that we experience, in our very cognition of reality, which is supposed to be ever new, taken through snapshots. And because we are taking it through snapshots, so we cannot say that this is real and this is finally real. So we have to really think about the changing nature of ever new. So how do we think about the changing nature of ever new, something that is ever new? How our brain comes to terms with it? Well, this is a process of constructing a loop, as cognitive scientists would say. We construct a loop between what is old, what we see now, and what is going to change. There are three snapshots involved. And from the last snapshot, we try to return back to the original. But by the time the original has also changed. But our brain has entered into a loop which takes us to the ever new. And this is what Advaita Vedanta is saying, which is justifiable in terms of our understanding and cognitive sciences. Now let's look at classical Indian philosophy, how it tries to justify this kind of a process. And I will end it there with two more arguments. I can go on and on, but I think there is a limitation of time. So one of the arguments that comes from Nyaya Sutra, because Prabhakara Mimamsa, and Nyaya Sutra by Gautama, they are termed as realists. They are supposed to be dealing with real. So what is real according to Nyaya? That's very, very important question. So one of the answers is that the real is something about which you are aware and which corresponds to an object. But there are a lot of things in between we can say. What we are aware of. Can we know what we are aware of without an intuition? We must have an intuition of what we are aware of. But all the time we may not have that intuition. Some of the intuitions may be lacking. I may not have an intuition of taste when I drink water. We say that water is tasteless. No, water has a lot of taste because it has a lot of minerals. But we don't have that intuition. So, can we all the time have that intuition that allows our awareness to know that we are aware of something? It's a big question. And Prabhakara Mimamsa, Prabhakara raises this question, and he would say that, you see, mental representations are there, but there is no guarantee that your mental representation shall correspond to your object of awareness. It might correspond to something else, about which you are not aware of, which can happen in your artistic kind of activity, that you are not aware of what you are presenting, though you have a mental representation of what you are presenting. Okay? Many times artists have a mental representation, but what they have drawn, what they have written are totally different than the mental representation that they have. Prabhakar Mimamsa is pointing out that this is not an error, that our mental representation and presentation of object are different. That's not an error, not necessarily an error, but that's a kind of a capacity of our mind to think in terms that extend the capacity to cognize, that extend our capacity to think, and to make us think creatively, Prabhakar is saying. So this is something very important. So going by much of the Indian philosophical thinking, our claims of knowledge, when I say, I know that, Sherlock Holmes lived in such and such street in London, in Baker Street in London. When I make such a statement, Sherlock Holmes, I know that Sherlock Holmes lives there. Then I go to Baker Street, I look for his house, and I don't get his house. Does it mean that my mental representation of Sherlock Holmes being a detective is actually erroneous? No, it's not erroneous. We can call it fictional. We can call it poetic. The perception of God, or extrasensory perception of a divine intuition by many of the saints, Ramana Maharshi or Jiddu Krishnamurti, these are not erroneous perception, but this is a part of creative, symbolic, sacred, spiritual kind of thinking, in which the object of correspondence is not given, but it has to be created, recreated in the form of snapshots that Professor Rao was talking about. So therefore, Indian philosophy produces this huge amount of creativity. Probably such an amount of creativity is missing in European philosophy, in Anglo-American philosophy. Professor Davidson, another teacher of mine, he would say that these notions of truth, knowledge, etc. are actually fictitious. Clearly, he would say, they are nothing beyond your social constructions. Your society constructs a certain notion of truth and knowledge and then produces a proof about it. But this is nothing beyond fiction, because our language cannot hold such truths. He is very clear about it, Professor Davidson, my teacher. And his position is very close to thinking creatively, thinking artistically, thinking imaginatively, which again now you can see our ChatGPT and the latest form of AI in the form of large language models. What these models are doing, they are copying everything together, producing a mega copy of something. And that is very creative way of copying. We cannot copy so fast as ChatGPT can copy. It's a plagiarism software. But it's such a plagiarizer that plagiarism becomes an art. Or you can call it plagiaristic art is more powerful than original art because of ChatGPT and large language models at this point in time. That's one way of thinking creatively. But what kind of thinking creatively is distinguishable from this kind of thinking? This morning, I was reading something very paradoxical. It's called Oxford Handbook of Lying. Oxford Handbook of Lying is a philosophical text, fat philosophical text. This morning I was looking at it from my shelf. Suddenly I turned one page, I see definition of red lie. Red lie. There are two kinds of lies, white lies and red lies. Red lies are those lies which we tell knowing fully well that the other fellow knows that it is false. Large language models create that kind of red lie. But white lie is something about which we are aware that this may happen, is within the realm of possibility. But still, it is something indecisive between truth and lying. But thinking creatively probably takes us beyond this notion of truth and lying, as Nietzsche would love to tell us. Nietzsche would say, thinking creatively would mean continually reaffirming something